continuing with the case in favor of the documentary hypothesis before moving on to make the case against it. Another alleged contradiction between the different sources, P and J, has to do with the creation account. In Genesis 1, which is P's account, plants are created 3 days before man was created, and animals are created on the same day but before man. But in Genesis 2's account, plants and animals are created after man. This is seen as a contradiction due to different authors, and the editors didn't try to harmonize the two accounts, but simply reproduce both despite the blatant contradictions. The fourth pillar of the documentary hypothesis is called doublets. Doublets refer to slightly different versions of the same story. And the theory is this, that the redactor had various sources which often told slightly different versions of the same incident. And rather than eliminate any of the versions that came in the sources, the editor included them all. But the similarities would indicate that they are the same story, though it's like a story told at a party where maybe you tell the person next to you a short story and they tell the person next to them. By the time it goes around the room, it gets garbled. So there's similarities that show they're basically the same story, but they get garbled over time. Examples of this, one would be two accounts of creation, but the better example would be the three places where you nearly lose a matriarch to a foreign king. Happens with Sarah in Egypt in Genesis 12. It happens with Sarah in Gerar in Genesis 20. Genesis 12 is with Pharaoh. Genesis 20 is with Abimelech. But it also happens with Rebekah in Gerar in Genesis 26. And presumably these are very unusual types of things to happen 3 times, twice to the same patriarchal wife, twice in the same place by different patriarchal wives seems highly unlikely. And they argue that, well, these 3 accounts represent 3 sources, Genesis 12J, Genesis 20E, Genesis 26P. The 5th pillar is called composite sections. Now, Wellhausen faced a problem, and the problem was that there are some passages where the name Yahweh and the name Elohim are freely mixed together. You have that in the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9. You have it in the Joseph story in Genesis 37, and also on the blessing on Isaac in chapter 27. And so this looks like a problem for the JEDP theory. Wellhausen tried to show, though, that these contradictory sources did exist, but were interwoven together. And by this kind of clever argumentation, Wellhausen turned an argument against his theory into an argument in favor of it. Now, what I would like for you to do is to compare the columns. On the left, you'll see a column that shows the Yahweh's account of the flood according to the Wellhausen sources. And on the right, you'll have the priestly account of the flood from those same chapters. And the idea is that you have one complete version of the flood story in the Yahweh's, another complete version of the flood story in the priestly version, and that they've been kind of cut apart and pasted together to form the story that we now have. And instead of reading this to you, I'll just have you read these passages. I'll change slides and let you look at them a few seconds, and then you can pause and read, and then at the end we'll make some comments. Now, if you have read those parallel accounts side by side, or if you were to read a whole column just by itself, you'll see the following. You can see that both stories are more or less complete in themselves, thus demonstrating that they could have existed independently and before they were combined together. Second, the divine name does follow the pattern. The priestly account uses Elohim. The Yahwist account uses Yahweh. The priestly account shows its customary genealogical concerns, whereas the J account does not. The priestly account uses a special term to establish a covenant, which is said to be a favorite term for making a covenant by the priestly writer. If you compare the accounts, there are contradictions in time. J talks about there being 40 days and 40 nights, and then they disembark after 3 weeks, whereas P's account speaks of the flood lasting for over a year. There's also a contradiction in theological emphasis. P's account portrays God as a transcendent lawgiver, giving detailed instructions concerning the ark, whereas J portrays God as more anthropomorphic, where God sees things, God is sorry about things, God smells things like a human being as he smells the sacrifice at the end of the flood. So those are the 5 pillars of the documentary hypothesis: the divine name, and the distinction between Yahweh and Elohim, the differences in language and style, alleged contradictions between the sources, doublets where the same story is told more than once in different sources, and composite sections where it can be argued that that different sources were woven together to form a new whole. That's the case, and I think you would agree that it can sound pretty convincing. But how strong are these pillars? And in the discussion that follows, we will test them one by one.